You're listening to Big Table, a podcast about books and conversation presented by Hat and Beard Press, Dub Lab, and Gold Diggers in Los Angeles. I'm your host, JC Gabel. For each episode, we speak to one author about a singular book in a long-form interview. Each interview is then followed by a brief reading, sometimes from the same book being discussed, sometimes by a like-minded title and a different author. But every episode does retain a loose theme throughout, and is inspired by the work of radio host and oral historian Studs Terkel. Thanks for listening. Lula Carson Smith, otherwise known as the writer, essayist, and playwright Carson McCullers, never published an autobiography in her short but prolific life. McCullers suffered from several health ailments throughout her life, including rheumatic heart disease. She also suffered from several strokes that had begun in her youth. This underlying condition, coupled with her alcoholism, led to her left side being paralyzed from age 31 until her death at age 50 in 1967. She was incapacitated and needed to dictate her later work. Enter writer Jenn Shapland, author of My Autobiography of Carson McCullers, published by Tin House, which was nominated for the National Book Award for Nonfiction in 2020. Shapland's book is a well-researched examination of Carson McCullers' life and work, but it is also a hybrid memoir of her own, as she came to terms as a queer person throughout the writing of this, her first book. We caught up this fall by phone from her home in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where she lives with her partner, editor and art historian Chelsea Weathers. I led in with the etymology of the final title of the book. Here's Jenn Shapland. Right off the bat, I love the title. It's very clever, and I'm curious how you came up with it, and at what point in the process of the manuscript did you settle on that title?
Yeah, it's funny. I think the title kind of came early on, and the book itself started as these fragments that I was writing in response to some of the items that I was cataloging while I was working as an intern at the Harry Ransom Center, like you mentioned, in Austin. And I was cataloging some clothes, some personal effects, kind of these random different objects for a number of different authors, including Carson McCullers. And out of that work, I started just sort of writing these little notes about the objects themselves, trying to ask them questions and just understand why they were there. And there's, somewhere in my notebook at the time, around the time that I was doing that cataloging work, I just have a note that said, I should try to write an autobiography of Carson McCullers. So it was almost like the idea for the title was there really, really early on before I had any idea what I was doing. But there was definitely a sense on my part, here's someone who really tried to tell her own story, this author, Carson McCullers. She kind of kept trying to write a memoir throughout her life, and then she never really got to tell it. So, it was clear to me very early on in the process, I want to figure out a way to help get the story told. And then this question of kind of what would it mean to write someone else's autobiography. And I should say that at the time I was cataloging McCullers' personal effects, I was also cataloging the personal effects of Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas. So I probably had thoughts about the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas in my mind as well, in which Stein writes an autobiography for someone else. So I think those ideas were sort of bouncing off each other. Wow,
that's a great connection. And it's kind of where my mind went when I first saw the title, just as someone who used to work as a magazine editor too and write headlines. I thought of Alice B. Toklas. I remember when the University Press published at some point, I think it was, you said in the late 90s, Illumination and Night Glare, which, as you alluded to a minute ago, were kind of her attempts at certain times of writing autobiography or writing her own memoir. And if I remember correctly, you said that, at this point she was incapacitated, so she dictated this stuff. But what really makes your book stand out is that you had access to the therapy transcripts that were not made public until, I'm hoping I have the timeline right, 2013, at which point a lot more comes into focus about her life that was not necessarily left out, but was only alluded to or was kind of vaguely written about, in previous books about her, most notably the Virginia Spencer Carr book, which I think came out in the 70s after her death.
Yeah, that came out in 75, and the Illumination and Night Glare, which was McCullers' kind of unfinished autobiography, came out in 1999, and McCullers herself died in 67. The transcripts, I kind of came upon those by happy accident when I was at the McCullers Center in early 2016. So I was staying at the McCullers House, which is a museum in Columbus, Georgia, and was digging around in the archives there at Columbus State University. And I'd had a tip from the director to go take a look at what was in the Mary Mercer archive. I knew that Mary Mercer was Carson's therapist kind of for the last, or toward the end of her life, and that they were in a really close relationship, but it was never like super clearly defined what their relationship was, why they were so close. So I was digging around in these archives, and Mary Mercer's papers were basically unavailable to the public until 2013, which was the year she died. So from Carson's death in 1967 to 2013, none of the stuff was available to researchers or biographers or anything like that. Mary Mercer herself was pretty closed up when it came to talking to reporters, biographers, really anyone about Carson or about, the way their lives were entwined. But what I found was a set of transcripts of their therapy sessions from 1958, which was when they first met. Carson at that time wanted to use the therapy sessions as a way to write her autobiography. And so this was kind of an earlier attempt than Illumination and Night Glare. And she thought, okay, I'm having this writer's block and I haven't sold a book in a while. A lot of trauma had happened in her life. She lost a lot of people. And she recognized that she really needed help. She really needed to talk to someone, but she didn't feel like she could afford it. So she decided that maybe if she worked with Mary in therapy, they could record the sessions, and that would be the first draft of her autobiography. So that was really interesting as a connection point for me, just in thinking about Carson writing her autobiography. What would it mean for her to tell her own story? That's really what she's trying to do in these therapy transcripts. But then the longer I spent reading those and trying to sort of decipher what's left of them and looking at the materials in that archive, I just found so many letters and cards and just evidence of this basically 10-year relationship between the two women. And it was much closer and much different than what I had read about. So it was almost like these materials that were made available in 2013 kind of suddenly opened up this last chapter of Carson's life that until that point had sort of been under wraps or had been unavailable for researchers.
I think one of the salient points that stood out to me, and I think I circled it in pencil when I was reading the book the first time, was that while working on this was the first time you'd ever encountered sort of really well-written love letters between women.
Yeah, that happened early in the process. Kind of my first entry point into this was a series of letters between Carson and a woman named Anne Marie Schwarzenbach, who was a photographer and writer. That's what I found sort of by accident at the Ransom Center that first got me super interested in Carson, when I hadn't really spent much time with her work before that. But they were beautifully written letters. They were definitely love letters between women. They were quoting poetry. They were quoting all kinds of different texts and philosophy. They were talking about their writing specifically, their lives as kind of creative women and as artists, and all of that was just like something I'd really never seen on paper before.
I think of us always and remember everything. I long for the food you used to make. At the New York Cafe, it is much worse than it used to be. I found a cooked fly in my soup not long ago. It was mixed with the vegetables and the noodles like lettuce. But that is nothing. The way I need you is a loneliness I cannot bear. Soon I will come again. My vacation is not due for 6 months more, but I think I can arrange it before then. I think I will have to. I'm not meant to be alone.
I think you, in your book, too, I guess are sort of searching for some sense of place, and I guess that's what Carson was also looking for most of her life. And one of the things that stood out to me, because there's so many famous pictures of her that get used over and over again, but it really did seem like her creative communities, both in February House, but also at Yaddo, that those kind of creative communities were really important to her, and those friendships, not just, for her sanity, but I think also for her creativity.
Yeah, definitely. Was there a specific photo you were thinking of?
Yeah, there's a picture of all the writers who were there at that particular outing at Yaddo, which I think was sometime in the 40s. And then there's a couple of her sort of sitting at a desk, and I assume that those are also in Yaddo, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, I think some of the desk ones too are on kind of her various. There are several like that where she's actually on a porch at a desk, which I always find kind of interesting, and some that are in her different kind of studies or bedrooms. But yeah, the photos are such an important record, and were so useful for me in just trying to recreate some of the dynamics in these communities, which is one of the things that, like you said, it was so important for Carson. It was so important for her life, her sanity, but also her writing, and her kind of confidence in her own voice, I think. And it was also really important to her, just for her queer life, for her life as a queer person kind of seeking community and identity. And so she spent a lot of time at Yaddo, and she spent a lot of time with writers at February House and other kind of groups of writers in and around, and artists and musicians, composers, dancers, choreographers, in and around Nyack, New York, later in her life. And the photographs of those communities really kind of give you access to these components that don't show up in the historical documents and records. For one, they show some of the relationships, between different people that you might not expect to see together. But then they also show sort of their style, what they're wearing, which is always interesting to me, and just kind of almost the vibe or the energy, the dynamic between the people. And so those were really useful for just kind of understanding her in the context of community.
That's a great segue, I think, into kind of how you wrote this book as a hybrid in a way. It is an autobiography of Carson McCullers, but it's also sort of an autobiography about you yourself. You have some health problems as well, which is something that plagued her through most of her life. So how did you arrive at that? Where, because I think what makes the book stand out to me so much is your story kind of intertwined with hers, and it's sort of told in these vignettes, which I think was a very clever way to tell the story.
I think the way I came into it, and I didn't really realize at first that I was going to be writing as much about my own life as I did. But one of the things that was really difficult to write about were these relationships that she had with Anne-Marie, with Mary, with other women, and kind of her evolution, just in terms of her sexuality and in terms of her relationships with women. It was really hard to write about those just using the historical records and documents that I had without bringing my own experience into the frame. And so I talk about this in the book as sort of learning to read like a queer person, right? Like learning to see what's in between the lines, learning that certain biographers, especially Virginia Spencer Carr, writing in 1975, are going to be using these euphemisms that if you are a lesbian, if you are a queer person, you're going to see this was like, so-and-so's prized traveling companion, and you're just going to laugh because you know what that means.
Yeah.
It's quite obvious. But yet at the same time, that writing, that tendency to cast all these relationships in euphemism has the effect of closeting these writers and these figures for people who come later, for people like myself who's just trying to kind of figure out what the story was. And so my writing of this book and my research, reading all these biographies, getting into the archives, was happening at the same time that I was sort of coming to terms with my own identity, with my own sexuality, and kind of, in the process of coming out. And so those things all kind of merged in the process of writing, and it became clear that in order to show, why I was so interested in this material and why it felt important to me to retell this story, I was going to have to sort of, put my own story on the page as well, and really show where I was coming from, really show kind of not just what was in the frame, but who was looking at the frame, who was doing the framing.
One by one, they would come to Singer's room to spend the evening with him. The mute was always thoughtful and composed. His many-tinted gentle eyes were grave as a sorcerer's. Mick Kelly and Jake Blunt and Dr. Copeland would come and talk in the silent room, for they felt that the mute would always understand whatever they wanted to say to him, maybe even more than that.
There's one analogy in the book which it stood out with me, partially because I also go by my initials, but Carson McCullers' full real name before getting married was Lula Carson Smith, and she went with Carson, much like Elizabeth Miller became Lee Miller in part because it was purposely androgynous. And you mentioned in your book that initially, although this is not the case with your first book, you went by just J. Shapland. And I guess, you were mentioning a minute ago how while you were working on this book, you yourself were sort of coming to terms with, coming out and being queer. And do you think that was sort of a device that you unknowingly did just to process that?
I think it must have been. That was really when I was in college. And I wanted to be taken seriously so badly, by my professors, most of whom at the time, most of whom were men, really, especially my advisors and like all the people I worked with on my thesis and things like that. And so somehow I definitely had this idea in my mind that I would be taken more seriously if I used my initial. I imagine that Lula Carson felt something like that, felt like, if I just use the Carson and ditch the Lula, people might take me more seriously. Like, I don't know if that's why, but that's kind of my guess. And I think that it's kind of common for women writers to do that. There's almost like an attempt to trick the reader, right, into making me like assuming the kind of universal within our culture, which is always like the male voice. And I think that I was probably like playing around with that a little bit at the time. But yeah, it's kind of funny to think about. And it's interesting to look at kind of the history of writers, women writers who've changed to their names. And, just at the number of people I encounter who assume Carson McCullers was a man just based on the name. That still happens. Like if I mention, offhand, I wrote this book about Carson McCullers, the question's always, who's he? And then there's kind of a little conversation about that. So yeah, there's this like, the bid for gender neutrality. Like,
yes, exactly.
It has a long history. Yeah.
There's a great bit in that book, Illumination in Night Glare, which I think kind of speaks to what you were getting at in your book, which I'm just going to read back a couple of lines. It's and this is Carson talking here. I've used the word illumination several times. this might be misleading because there were many frightful times where I was totally unilluminated and feared that I would never write again. This fear is one of the horrors of an author's life. Where does it come from? And what small episode will start the chain of creation? And I guess that's maybe a writer lamenting writer's block, or being in the midst of writer's block. But while working on this, did you, was it hard for you to finish a book like this because it was such an unusual format that ended up developing with it? It's not a straight biography at all, which is what I liked about it, frankly. I mean, I think more people will appreciate a book like yours than the doorstoppers of yore, which, although I do love those kind of womb to tomb biographies, it's very hard for people to find the time nowadays to read that. So I guess buried in there, my question is, you said you worked on this for several years, before it came to fruition. Was there any writer's block along the way about, how to complete something like this when there are still some unknowns about her that you may never know?
Sure. Yeah, there definitely was. And I think that the form of the book, these short chapters, there's like 80 chapters, even though it's only 200 some pages. I really wanted that to kind of reflect the absences, the gaps in the narrative, the things that I couldn't figure out, or that we still don't know, that we might never know. I wanted there to be some blank spaces there, as opposed to what we're describing, the straight biography, the biography that, begins with birth and ends with death, that tries to fill in every moment of a person's life. That those are also fun and fascinating for me to read. But I agree with you. I think that it's not a form that a lot of people can really, sink their teeth into necessarily, especially like in a culture that is as kind of fast-paced and bite-sized as ours. But I think, I think that, writing in these fragments, writing in these short chapters or vignettes, was a way for me to kind of approach those absences and leave them intact, show, where there was information that I couldn't actually find. But I really did get frustrated at certain points with that missing information. And I document some of that, like when I found the therapy transcripts, and like that seemed like a huge find. And I found a lot of, really interesting and important information about Carson's relationships, how she characterized them, how she understood herself, how she understood her life narrative. But there were still like key themes that were just totally missing. Some of them had been blacked out with like a Sharpie. Some of them were just like, almost incoherent, like very hard to understand. And I would get so frustrated, like, oh my gosh, I finally have this document and it's still so obtuse, so difficult for me to understand. And so it became really hard toward the end to finish the book, to know when the book was finished. And part of it, too, was just being so deep in the material, so deep in this one person's life, and having kind of tracked her life for so long, for a number of years. Like you said, I think it took me like 6 or 7 years to write. And for having kind of read about it from so many different angles, like at a certain point, I couldn't think about anything without it being somehow related to Carson McCullers. And so, it was very hard to kind of wind my way out of the maze that I had set up for myself and figure out, like, when can I leave this story feeling like I have done it justice.
This is kind of a good segue. This is just something out of curiosity, and this doesn't relate back to the book, but I'm curious what you're working on next. What are you going to write about next, and are you working on that right now?
Yeah, I'm working on 2 different projects. One is an essay collection that started in like 2018 or so. And some of the essays continue like themes that I was working on in my dissertation, having to do with the environment and with toxicity, actually. But it's a collection of kind of personal essays, or I don't really know what to call them. They're essays. They're written in my voice, just like the McCullers book. And they're set in my life in New Mexico. I'm thinking about questions of healing and kind of new age healing practices, toxicity, and the history of Los Alamos and Trinity Test Site in New Mexico, kind of the legacies of nuclear waste and nuclear waste storage.
Well, that sounds fascinating and right up my alley, especially the New Mexico history part.
Yeah, this place is fascinating. New Mexico is crazy, and I think, I am trying for my own purposes. Like, I've been writing some grant applications and things. Like, how do I connect, the different projects? Like, how do I connect Carson McCullers to this book about New Mexico? And the connection that I've found is just an attempt to illuminate, there's that word again, or to kind of, shed light on histories that are sort of invisible.
The town was in the middle of the Deep South. The summers were long and the months of winter cold were very few. Nearly always the sky was a glassy, brilliant azure and the sun burned down riotously bright. The town was a fairly large one. On the main street, there were several blocks of 2- and 3-story shops and business offices, but the largest buildings in the town were the factories, which employed a large percentage of the population. These cotton mills were big and flourishing, and most of the workers in the town were poor. Often in the faces along the streets, there was the desperate look of hunger and of loneliness.
The basic theme is just the need to belong.
To belong to someone, to belong to
To belong to something, to feel oneself a part of life.
That last bit was Carson herself being interviewed in the 1950s. Prior to that, all previous readings were by actress Holly Hunter, reading from Carson's most cherished work, her first novel, and one of my personal favorites, The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. Special thanks to the National Endowment of the Arts Big Read program for their recordings. My Autobiography by Carson McCullers by Jenn Shapland, published by Tin House, is available now. Big Table is produced and presented by Hat and Beard Press, Dub Lab, and Gold Diggers in Los Angeles, and is supported by Invisible Republic, a nonprofit arts organization based in Chicago and Los Angeles. You can learn more about their community-based programs and publications at invisiblerepublic.org. Big Table would not exist in the audio world without the expert skill sets, friendship, and dedication of sound designer Matea Bain, audio engineer Jacob Ross, and senior editor Nick White. Special thanks to Eric Gorman at Gold Diggers and Alejandro Ale Cohen at Dub Lab for early encouragement and engineering prowess. Thanks again for listening.